this drop ship, instead of dropping the soldiers from inside, their combat drop pods are attached to the outside, and they deploy down off of that. And then as the pods go through the atmosphere, when it gets to a certain altitude, they're non-reusable. They're one-time use pods where they blow off, and then the soldier themselves that's in an armor suit lands, and they've got, like, powered thrusters or whatever, but it's just to get them
So
down.
that's
But
that's
then
kind of a one-way ride. I mean, to get back out, you're going to have to win.
well,
Troopers fall through an endless sky. Military sound and science fiction contest.
hello and welcome to this episode of the Military Science Fiction Podcast. I am Josh Hayes here with Rick Partlow, and our other two co-hosts have been abducted.
By aliens.
Unfortunately.
We're intent on invading.
Yes. So because they're not here, we're doing kind of an impromptu episode today, and we're going to be talking about naming conventions, whether it's aliens or planets or weapons, whatever it is. We're going to talk about it, and probably hit some good tangents along the way, and we'll see how well the two of us can carry an episode.
Yeah, we've left the most talkative of us behind, so it's it'll be
Indeed.
a lot
Maybe
of
it's just
staring.
we can sit here and just look at each other, stare into each other's eyes. Man, naming conventions is one of those weird things where sometimes they're fun for me, and other times they're just a huge pain in the butt, and I
To me,
ignore
they are
them.
always a huge pain in the butt.
uh, I I don't know. Sometimes I don't write a lot of aliens in my novels. So a lot of the names that I usually have to brainstorm are like equipment or some kind of new tech or whatever. But let's start with aliens, because I know that you have written several different species and different kinds. Um, to start off the conversation, how do you, when you first sit down and you know you're going to have aliens in your story, do you think of the name first, or do you think of what the aliens are going to be and how they're going to affect your story, and then kind of work out the name from there?
Well, whenever I name aliens, I think of two things. One is that this is going to be an audiobook eventually, and some poor narrator is going to have to read that out loud and know how to pronounce it every time.
Right.
And two, when I was in my media writing class in my sophomore year of college, the professor was a former sports writer for the Tampa Tribune, and he wrote science fiction. So he showed me this short story that he wrote that was about to be published by Analog Magazine. It's back in the late '80s when that meant something.
Right.
And the main alien race was supposed to be a take on the Hudson Bay Company, I think it was, from 18th century England. So he called them the Sahudoni, the S''Huddoni. And at the time, I'm like, I understand where he's coming from, but I am so over, at the time, the late '80s. This was like the heyday of all the apostrophes and the glottal stops and the exclamation point that's supposed to be a clicking sound or something in
Right.
alien names that you can't pronounce. And when you look at it, reading it on a page, and you're in the flow of the story, and then you come to something like that, it just stops you in your tracks, where you have to come up with a nickname for them. So I try to make my alien name something easy to pronounce, something that's not going to make the audience stop, or the readers stop in the middle of the page and say, how do you pronounce this word?
Right.
Now it's easier in my books because this is kind of a philosophical thing, but in my opinion, if we were to come across aliens who truly evolved independently on a different world, they will be so different from us that even communicating with them at all might be impossible for years. So I kind of cheat in almost every single universe I make. and the aliens I deal with aren't really natural aliens. They're almost always uh, genetically engineered by some alien from long ago that was all that different, but made these, as an experiment. So it makes it easier. So they're humanoid. They're not that far different from us. So maybe we both use verbal language and the same
So
kind
it's
of
kind of like quasi Star Trekky, where they're all the aliens, well, most of them anyway, are more or less humanoid.
yeah. I mean, there's there's energy clouds in Star Trek too, but it was hard to communicate with them.
Right. And
Um,
usually they weren't nice.
so like in the Glory Boy Drop Shipper universe thing, um, the main aliens are the Tawny, and I came up with that name uh, just because I like the sound of the Native American tribes, the Shawnee and the Pawnee. So I'm
Oh,
gonna call them
right.
the Tawny,
Yeah.
and I still have people pronounce it wrong, but at least once they get it, they
You
and
know,
you
it
can
surprised me with pronunciation how it can sound right in your head, and then somebody else says it, and you're like, "That's not at all what I wrote down on the." Even for like really common sounding names, you're like, That's not right."
well, the third time you've had a different narrator pronounce Corpsman as Corpsman, you know that
Right.
people can get anything wrong.
I kind of cheated a little bit in the book series I wrote called Tranquility, where there are aliens. I think that's the only that's well, I guess Terra Nova had a lot of aliens in it, but Terra Nova was more of like a Star Wars, Star Trek kind of thing where most of them are all humanoid and they communicate verbally and stuff like that. In Tranquility, I created a race kind of based on the Zerg from StarCraft, where they were they were animals, they were like kind of insects and almost like the bugs, the arachnids from Starship Troopers, where there was really
You,
no communication.
you said Zurg, my first thought was Toy Story.
Oh, right. I think they were called the Zerg in StarCraft, if I'm remembering. If I'm remembering correctly, they were called the Zerg, but I mean it's been a while since I played the game. But anyway, I cheated in the way that because they didn't communicate with humans, the humans just kind of made up their own names for the various types of aliens that were in the race of the
Mhm.
bad guys. So you had like oh man, like the generals were called overlords or something, and the soldiers were called something else. Man, I can't. I'm drawing a blank on all the names, but I purposely kind of left them almost faceless in a way, and I didn't have to come up with any crazy sounding apostrophe names. A lot of times when I come across those in science fiction and in fantasy, I really just kind of gloss over it. And in a lot of ways, depending on what book it is, it's hampered my enjoyment of the story. For instance, I read just
I
recently, I
agree.
read um, the last Stormlight book that Sanderson put out. Um, Wind and Truth. And there were a lot of names in that book they've got that, and they're not quite the apostrophe exclamation mark kind of thing, but they're not human words. They're not human names like we would understand them. And there was a lot of them. And when there's like maybe half a dozen or so, maybe even up to a dozen, I can kind of pinpoint, okay, this jumble of letters represents this thing over here, and I can correlate the two. But when there's dozens and dozens and dozens, and you come across a situation where some of the people are even calling those entities by different names, I just got really confused and I couldn't follow what was going on, and I had to really think about is this person this or is that person that? And I think in some ways it is fun to kind of brainstorm names and create different cool sounding things. But you're right, when it comes to audio, you've got to really kind of have some mercy for the narrators who are going to have to say it over and over and over again if
I
that's
mean,
a
if you do
major
have
part
a
of your
weird,
story.
if you do have a long, weird sounding name, I think the secret would be to say it once or twice, and then have the main characters give them a nickname.
Right.
But
Kind of like what's her name from The Fifth Element, where she was like
Lilu, blah,
Lilu,
blah, 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 blah,
not
blah.
yada 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 yada. Ooh, shorter. Yeah,
Lilu.
exactly. But again, like even when it comes to naming aliens, I think like what I did in Tranquility, like naming the different species within the race a different thing. I don't really like, and this is why I don't do a lot of aliens now. I don't like the for instance, in I can't think of the word, but in Star Trek, where you have like Klingon and Romulan, right? And they are all the same. They all are the same. Like that's
I heard
it.
I heard they were related.
Yeah, yeah. Or like Vulcan and Ferengi or whatever. You have like the different races of characters, but within those races, there isn't a whole lot of difference. There's not a
Yeah,
whole lot of
all Ferengi are greedy and
right.
money
What is
hungry.
that? What is the word I'm looking for? Monolithic?
Monolithic?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh, all of them are monolithic races, and there's not any um like notable differences. They don't have like, you know, uh uh different appearances really. I mean, yes, they kind of look different, like the Klingons have different ridges on their heads or something like that. And but other than that, they don't look
Except for
there's
the old
not
Klingons, but we do not talk about
we don't talk about them.
them.
Uh, and that's one of the reasons I don't do aliens because in my view, I'd want to, you present like the human civilization, and you've got a whole bunch of different dialects. You have a whole bunch of different ethnic backgrounds. Humans look different based on where they come from and their heritage and all of that. And I feel like if I was going to create a race of alien beings in a book, whether it is a bad guy or a good guy, I'd want to do that, and that would take a substantial amount of time to really nail down like
Well,
what are the differences and
even with the Tani, who were basically humanoid, they were created by an ancient race from Neanderthals, really. Um, just to get inside their heads, they were still a culture that differentiated from us hundreds of thousands of years ago. So it's still just to do that, even though they're basically human, tiny, but they're a little different because they're like a pre-human hominid, but that was genetically advanced. But just getting inside their head was tough, and it took several books over different series for me to get inside the head of one of them enough to feel comfortable. And that's
right,
something that's not even that different. Um,
right,
in the Birthright universe, the only real aliens, um, see, even the predecessors, the ones who created all these different races in our galaxy, were from Earth.
mm,
They evolved from theropod dinosaurs, and they uh, they left Earth when the temperature started changing after the asteroid. They left Earth within a few 100,000 years and left it to us, and then they kept meddling with it. But the only real aliens were the ones that wound up driving them out of the galaxy, and those are like kind of a hive mind. So I never really had to worry
right,
about getting inside their heads or giving them any name except the name the predecessors gave them.
right, exactly. So again, you kind of cheated a little bit because
Yeah.
yeah, I I like some books with aliens, but sometimes I think that they can get a little kind of carried away with being kind of like the faceless horde of enemies that you're just kind of fighting against. Um, Really, what I like doing is coming up with new and interesting names for tech. Uh,
Yeah.
I really
Well, my
enjoy,
favorite is coming up with new star drives.
yeah. Well, I mean, along the same lines, like in the manuscript that I'm working on right now, Weaponized Fury, one of the characters is she's basically a hacker, and I call them spikes in this universe. But because of that, she intuitively would know the names of like different computer systems and protocols and matrices. So when I'm in her head and I'm talking about different things from her perspective, I use a lot of like techno babble, and I really enjoy kind of coming up with that kind of stuff. But in a way that when you read it, you, it it's not confusing, and you're not just like, oh, it doesn't make any sense in the
Also,
context of what you're.
you have to make it so it doesn't sound like just BS that you pulled out of your butt. You
No,
have to
exactly. There was a
you have to make it sound sort of like the stuff that exists now, except
right.
projected into the future.
There was one there was a sequence in I want to say it was one of the Terra Nova books. I want to say it was the third one, where one of the characters was doing something with a computer or some kind of high-tech system. And have you ever seen that video from back in, I think it was the 90s? It was a YouTube video, and it was like an engineering video, and but it was basically a meme video where he was talking about um, the hydro spanner sprockets that go on to the junction. So it was basically an entire video where he said a whole bunch, and it was all nonsense. Like none of the words he said were correct.
I think I do remember that now that you say it. Yeah.
Yeah. So what I did is I basically pulled like lines out of that video and used
Hmm.
those lines in the
Yeah.
book
Yeah.
as like a callback to the video. So if you'd seen the video, you were like, "Oh, he's riffing off that video." But it was just that was the only time I'd ever kind of done that deal. But
That sounds a little like military jargon speak.
yeah,
I did
um,
a scene with that in one of the Earth at War books where the main character just goes in front of a group of his soldiers and is like just doing basically jargon like in the battle space we're going to do the and he just keeps I forget the exact words but he keeps going and they're like looking at each other like is he putting us on?
right. What I think is interesting is uh, in military terms, when you're in, you don't really even think about it when you're talking about it. Like you think of like the acronyms or the certain way that you describe things in the military, and you speak like that and you don't even think about it. And if you were to write a novel in those terms, it would almost look like a jumbled mess of uh barely understandable things that people wouldn't get. But if you use it in dialogue, minimally, you can get away with it, and it gives you a lot of authenticity. I try to keep the narrative fairly like general, clean, and then occasionally I'll throw into dialogue like a military acronym, and so he's not like doing a litany of go to the AARP on the NSA and talk to the CIA on the AAC and AAR or whatever, and I try to keep those things to a minimum, but I also like coming up with, you have the M4, so I like to come up with weapon names that are descriptive but kind of military sounding, um, without going over the top. I like coming up with model names for like fighters or what
Yeah.
I really like doing is like civilian vehicles because everybody uses I remember one of the first novels I wrote uh way 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 back in the day. I basically stole all the fighter classes from Wing Commander and use those as the classes for like the rapier and the broadsword and all of those things. I used all those classes, and you can
What I like for fighters, especially, is like a theme.
mm-hmm.
You know, right now, the fighters we have, a lot of it, a lot of them are the names are taken from World War II fighters, like the A-10 Thunderbolt II. It's taken
Yeah,
from the Thunderbolt, or what's the F-35 called now? Shoot,
isn't that is that the Raptor or is that the
I thought the
22?
F-22 was the Raptor.
What is the F-35 though?
I gotta look it up. But anyway, but for a while, all our planes were named after birds. Eagle, Falcon,
Yeah,
Osprey,
it's Lightning. It's the Lightning
Lightning. Yeah,
too.
which is also a World War II plane.
Yeah.
Um, so I like to have like a theme. Um, but
Do you do like for fighters you have like one theme, like say it's like birds of prey, and then from bombers you have another theme that's
uh,
something else, and then for
I don't have space. I'm not what's his name? Ryan Johnson. I don't have
oh
space bombers.
right. I mean, I can't remember what um I can't remember what book I was working on uh when I was thinking about that, but it's I don't I think it's one of my unpublished things, but I had like bombers and I had attack fighters and I had like recon fast kind of stealth craft. Um for like transport shuttles, I have like a different naming convention for those. For like say dropships, I have a different naming convention for those depending on if it's a like a company level dropship or like a squad level combat delivery shuttle or something like that.
I don't really much go in for um like naming models of like, well, I don't know how to put this. I name fighters, but when it comes to actual spaceships, like I don't really give them model like a dropship's a dropship,
Right.
uh, and assault shuttle is an assault shuttle. And the reason I do it that way is because I feel like when you're in a future where everything is fabricated easily, and instead of building a new one, for instance, like if you have improvements in technology you want to put on your assault shuttles, which is what they call in the birthright universe, they call that that's their dual environment. Basically, it's a fighter, but you just refit that thing, and it's
Yeah.
still your assault shuttle. And any assault shuttle you have might have the older tech or the newer tech. They just don't really name them much. I mean, there's a number, but they don't.
Sure.
Nobody uses. It's just an assault shuttle. But you got to name fighters for some reason. Like
I do.
I've got the my favorite is the Starblade.
I like that name.
That's from the Taken to the Stars series, and they got the Starblades, which are short range, uh, dual environment fighters, and then they have the Vanguards. The Vanguards are interstellar fighters. They're the smallest thing that can go into hyperspace. I mean, you can't go very far in them. Not that they couldn't go far, but you can't fit enough food and water and provisions inside this little fighter. And plus, you're in the fighter cockpit. How many days do you want to spend
Right.
sitting in a fighter cockpit?
Yeah. I do different models like specifically for like assault boats. I do a in weaponized, at least I have a couple of different delivery systems. One is like a ground combat assault dropship that's specifically designed to go through the atmosphere and to fly in atmosphere and drop the operators. This particular dropship, it's kind of modeled on it's interesting. We talked about Live, Die, Repeat, or Edge of Tomorrow a couple of
Yeah.
podcasts ago. This dropship, instead of dropping the soldiers from inside, their combat drop pods are attached to the outside, and they deploy down off of that. And then as the pods go through the atmosphere, when it gets to a certain altitude, they're non-reusable. They're one-time use pods where they blow off, and then the soldier themselves that's in an armor suit lands, and they've got, like, powered thrusters or whatever, but it's just to get them
So
down. But
that's
then
kind of a one-way ride. I mean, to get back out, you're going to have to win.
well, they can get picked up in the drop shuttle. Like, it's got an internal bay, but that's not how they deploy. It's the quickest way down, and then once they're done, the ship
Well,
can
when I
come
say
in.
win, I mean you're gonna have to secure a landing zone for that drop shuttle to come get you. There's no way like, oh, we can't win, we got to get out. Oh no,
Right.
you're gonna have to you're gonna
Yeah.
have to make a place for it to land.
Exactly. So I have that, but I also have, like, ship to ship assaulters too, where if they're assaulting a ship and they've got to breach it and board, that's a different class of assault boat. So I try to think of I don't like having like a one size fits all unit. So, like, if they're assaulting a ship, they would have like a hull penetrator kind of deal, or something where it's really fast and kind of stealthy, and it can attach to the side of a warship, and it's got like breaching lasers or whatever. I like to come up with different craft, and then I like coming up with names. So the more different types of craft I can have, that means I get to have more names, and that's fun for me. Uh, one of the funnest, one of the most fun I have in naming conventions, especially in sci-fi, is coming up with like civilian car models. Uh, uh, be like I have several sequences that are on like planets that don't have anything to do with like a military action, and I don't like the repetitive, and then he went to a car, and then he went to another car, and then he went to a four-door car, and then he went to like a big kind of van car. And so I try to come up with interesting sounding names. I can't remember what book I used it in, but I had like a Honda something, but it wasn't like the Honda was combined with a different name. So it was like a Ford Honda or something like that. But I also
I've seen that a lot in like 80s, 90s, near future sci-fi. They'll like make it like a Colt and Wesson or a Heckler and
sure.
Colt or something like that. Which the
Right.
problem you wind up there is one of those companies might just go out of business,
Right.
in 10 years, and then you're screwed.
100%. Yeah.
Like, who is it that's some companies getting bought out right now? Is it Honda's buying out Nissan or something like that? Some big name. I can't remember what it is, but
Oh, I don't know.
so anybody that, if that was true, if I can't remember, but if that was true, if you put like a Nissan anything in your future, you're
If they get bought out, you're screwed.
it's a retro future now.
That's
the funny thing about all those cyberpunk books you read that you read back in the 80s and 90s, is they all have all these Japanese companies in charge of everything. And the Japanese are like in charge of the world. And now the Japanese are barely hanging on, and they're nobody at the time, I think no science fiction writer at the time ever considered more I don't know the word, meta forces like demographics. I never thought
Right.
about demographics at all until I started listening to Peter Zeihan, his videos and his books. It's like, oh yeah, this population's going down. Everybody's getting older. Crap. What am I going to do with my future where everybody wants to get off the planet?
Right. I don't know if we've ever talked about using AI on the podcast before, and I know that's kind of a tumultuous subject for some people, but
I try not to tell anybody about the implant computer AI that I have.
right, I've
The
got
secret to my fast writing.
the Starlink chip.
Yeah.
I've used ChatGPT a lot when it comes to naming things.
Oh
And
yeah.
it's good for some things, and other things it's not so good. Like
You
I'll
have to
have it.
massage it. You have to massage it.
Yeah. I
I'll ask
used to
it.
use like
I'll ask it name. Give me a name for a city on a colony world, for example.
right. Yeah.
Um, and it'll give me crap like Star City or Void Town, and I'm like, no, make it a name that sounds like people actually named it and live there.
Right. I've had it give me names for like weapons and stuff. One of the I had it give me 10 futuristic car model names. And so some of them were really, really on the nose. Like one was a Quantum Drive X1. Another one was a Nebula Cruise 3000. A Stellar Ride
Sounds like something
Infinity.
from the Jetsons.
Right. So some of them are, they're okay. Like one of them was an energetics pulse lux. It's ENERGETI capital X, which I thought was kind of interesting. That sounds like a really interesting proper name for a car. But I'll like kind of cherry pick different things. It's one of the things I used to use name generators for on the internet. I used to have a bookmark folder full of 20 or 30 different generators that you could go through and just
Well, the fantasy name generator page is invaluable, or it used to be before
100%.
we got ChatGPT.
Yeah. Well, and I mean that's I like I liked the generator pages, but I also like the ability to like ask GPT, give me some names for this, and then type in, can you make it a little darker or make it a little less whatever it is, and it'll take that into account and give you some ideas. I don't typically take them all wholesale or whole cloth rather. I kind of pick and choose and put them together. But that kind of brainstorming, ChatGPT is really good for. Um, Especially when it comes to like coming up with names for technical things in like computer systems or mechanical parts, stuff that I wouldn't think of. It's taken a lot of. Uh, I'm really good when it comes to like brainstorming, uh, like how a character is doing something, like an action scene or something like that. But when it comes to like ship mechanics, my mind automatically goes to communication and engineering, and it takes me a long time sometimes to think of what are some interesting things that you can do on a ship or use ship systems for. And so getting ideas about what type of systems would be on a futuristic ship, and it'll give me a list of those, and then I can kind of go down the list and come up with interesting names for those. Um, and
Yeah.
like I said before, I like keeping the names in context of what it is, instead of just doing techno babble. A lot of the scenes in Star Trek, especially when it came to like the engineering scenes, a lot of the stuff that they said didn't make any sense at all to anyone. And I've
Josh,
even
Josh, you just have to reverse the polarity.
exactly, that doesn't make any sense to me. I back in the day, I got this.
Oh yeah, yeah. Dude, I have the
And
one from the original series.
yeah,
It's probably worth a lot
um,
of money now, actually.
it was it was really helpful when I was doing like one of my very first fiction series. And of course I was a Star Trek geek at the time. I still like Star Trek, but um, just going through like some of the diagrams, it says upper vectored thrust nozzle and um mooring beam tractor emitter and low
Well,
vectored thrust.
vector thrust makes sense for a like a Harrier or an F-35, but what is it doing on a spaceship?
I don't I
What does
don't know.
God need with a vector thrust nozzle?
I don't know. Um, but I think I think sometimes you need to be careful with naming conventions, because sometimes you can get carried away, and sometimes it doesn't matter what it's called. And in my opinion, like I said with my hacker character, depending on the POV that you're going through, and I know you write a lot of first person stories, but depending on the POV that you're writing on, a lot of times that will speak to how the character sees the world and experiences the world. And so you may not need all the advanced sounding, techie sounding things. If he's just a thug, like a gun toting thug criminal, he wouldn't be thinking about all of that. He'd be just, give me the thing, and I don't care about any of the other stuff. And sometimes I use that as a cheat, so I don't
Yeah.
have to come up with names.
Well, I guess I use, I guess you call it cultural or technological. Anyway, the nature of the society they live in and how they make things. Like, for instance, a big thing in a lot of my books is you go to these colony worlds and they don't ship them, like a bunch of cars from a factory on Earth or wherever. They ship them an industrial fabricator, which you can use to make more industrial fabricators. You
Oh
get
yeah.
raw materials and you make vehicles off of patterns. So,
Oh
it's
yeah,
not
like a
really,
3D printed deal where you
yeah, it's
download the
not going to be,
plans.
it's not going to be like this is a Ford F-150. It's going to be, this is a hopper. A hopper is what they call a ducted fan hovercraft. It's like a,
Oh, okay.
it's like a helicopter with the blade underneath,
Yeah.
sort of. And they use that to get around, you know, short distances, a few hundred miles, a few hundred kilometers, sorry,
Right.
on colony worlds. Yeah, I'll tell you what, there's a couple of books that they're the main characters from the near future or present, and they're Americans. And it's so refreshing to be able to use imperial units in those books instead of the metric system.
Dude, when you said that, I was gonna say that I still have to find the feet to meters calculator and miles to kilometers. And I was in the military for 6 years, and that's how we, described distances and measurements and all of that.
I screwed up in one book. I was talking about a knife that somebody was using in a fight, and I think I said it was 10 centimeters long, and I wanted to say it was 10 inches long, and I screwed that up, and people like really nailed me for that. It's only like about 4 inches long or something.
Right. That's a really small blade.
Yeah.
I actually, it's interesting because I've been, in writing mil sci-fi for so long. Obviously, I've had to use the kilometers or the meters or whatever it is,
Mm.
and using the calculators. But uh, just the other day, I was trying to envision how big this ship is that they're on because I hadn't done it yet, and I needed to kind of place some things around the ship, and I still cannot visualize how long a meter is or how tall a meter is in terms of like how tall maybe a corridor or ship's corridor might be. And so I had to go, okay, it's going to be taller than 6 feet. So let's say it's 8 feet. What's 8 feet in meters? Because I visualize in feet.
Well,
Uh,
the
um,
worst part is when you're describing how tall somebody is,
yeah,
because there's no good way in metric to do it. They're 2 meters tall is like 6'9" or something. So
right.
you can't use that. Uh, so if somebody's like average height, 5'10", 5'11", even 6 feet, you're like, that's a meter and 770 centimeter. How do you put, what's an easy way to, you can't say 5'10". It's like, you have to put like a meter 7. And then people are like, 7 what? Well, it's decimeters, but it's not obvious, and it's a weakness in the metric system. There's no easy way to describe how tall somebody is.
It's just like 5'11" is 1.8 meters. But for me, it's a lot more natural to say he was 5'11"
Yeah,
rather than saying he was 1.8 meters tall. And I
I
think
know.
some of
Oh,
the
you can say that's why I give it the short end, like a meter 8, you know,
yeah, yeah,
and
yeah.
hope people understand what I'm talking about.
Like I wonder how it is in centimeters. Well, I've tried to do in naming conventions an easy way to do money.
Yeah,
And I don't know if you've come across this or not, but in weaponized there's a lot there's not a lot to do with money, but I wanted to make an interesting currency. instead of just using credits, because I feel like everybody in science fiction uses like just credits because it's easy and people understand it. So I came up with cryptics, um, based on the idea
That's a pretty
of,
cryptic idea to use.
yeah. Well, I thought about like at the time, Bitcoin and a whole bunch of the cryptocurrencies were like big in the news, and they still are kind of. So I kind of took the cryptocurrency and just called it cryptics. And but one of the things that I've been trying to figure out is how do I do that as like a dollar sign, and trying to figure out, is there a good ASCII character that I can use for that, or
Huh.
should I just use CR, but then CR could be credits as well. And so I haven't figured out a good way to do that, because I was going to use
I use
like,
different monetary systems for like, I figure in a galaxy you're going to have different. So I use like for the areas where they're controlled by corporations, I'll say like $100 in corporate script.
Mm,
And then when you're in like the boonies, they only deal in physical trade notes. And trade notes are like, you know, a physical token that's worth something inherently. Whereas
right.
corporate script is all, you know, digital money.
Um, I, 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 I like that idea, but I also like the idea of having like kind of a universal, uh, currency that everybody uses, kind of like the dollar, but I didn't want to call it the dollar or the yen or something like that. I think maybe on like individual planets that could work really well. And it could
For an
really actually
aliens, they
go,
used adjusted dollars.
yeah, yeah. Um, that's one of the most unrealistic things, actually, when when I think about, we've mentioned Star Trek a couple of times, is the complete lack of a currency in Star Trek, at least for the Federation, where like the
We don't
only
use
other
money. Money's
currency,
not, money's not important anymore.
we don't base our lives on the pursuit of, come on. But like the only currency that I can think of in Star Trek is like gold press latinum. Uh, I think that's, I don't know. Can you think of any other currency that was mentioned in Star Trek? I can't think of one.
Can't think of it. The problem is when you have a society where people are trading things, even if it's in the Federation, nobody uses money. Well, if you're dealing with another race, another alien species, they're going to want to trade with you. And you're going to have to trade something to get what they have.
Right,
They don't have the
right,
same philosophy you do.
for sure. Um,
You're going to barter with them every time you want to.
do you, so I know that you don't use model names for like different craft, but like for capital ships, I'm assuming that you have different classes
Um,
of capital ships.
it depends on the book. Um, like in some of the universes, they'll have different classes of name, but mostly they just have like cruisers or you just like in Birthright in the Tawny War, our big ships were called cruisers,
Mm,
and nobody really thought to give them another name because, like I said, they don't replace them with a new model. They just add stuff to them. You know, they retrofit what's there.
right,
Uh, so they're just cruisers. And if it's like the cruiser, Yorktown, well, if it gets new engines and new guns and new armor, it's still the cruiser Yorktown. It's not like a different
right.
class of cruiser. Um, but we call the enemy. We had the cruisers, which are big ships, and then we had missile cutters, which were small, um, relatively small starships that launched anti-ship missiles at the enemy's capital ships. And they had what we call destroyers and um, corvettes, I think. And their corvettes were basically the same thing as our missile cutters, except a little bigger. They're like a
Yeah,
smaller ship, but I didn't really use any class names in that one. On other ones, I've used like a president class, you know, cruiser or uh, battle class, like they're named after battles or presidents of various nations or
Yeah.
whatever.
I
I,
um I
the reason I don't get hung up on that is because I don't write a lot of like Navy style
right,
combat. So
right.
it's for a Marine who happens to be in a battle group that's traveling along with cruisers. He's not going to think, oh, that's a Eisenhower class cruiser. It's like, oh yeah, that's the cruiser whatchamacallit. That's the Yorktown or whatever.
I use classes a lot with my capital ships only because I think it sounds um well, it sounds cool. First of all,
You're
but
saying you're a classist?
yeah. But like even in conventional Navy, you have, like the Eisenhower class, whatever, or the God, I'm drawing a blank now, but like you have like a cruiser, but
Enter-
it's like a
the
name
Enterprise
class
class
cruiser.
or whatever.
Yeah, well, that's the Enterprise class or like the Galaxy class or whatever like that. Um, I I come up with ones for the military and ones for like a civilian deal. Like I've got a Stingray class, or I've got a, a Nebula class kind of deal. But again, I like to come up with ships that are used for specific things. So like you could have like a stealth combat cruiser or a missile cruiser like you're talking about, or a in Valor I had carrier class ships where they would carry fighters, but then I created a special class of battle cruiser, and I don't remember what the class was called, but it carried like a small contingent of fighters on it, so it was like kind of a hybrid uh warship carrier.
Mhm.
um I like coming up with class names for that and putting them in, just because it gives me another way to describe the ship in narrative without having to repeat the ship name, or um like just say battleship, right? Like, oh, the battleship came out of hyperspace. I could say like the something
Just sank
something
my
class.
battleship.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
I think the reason I didn't do that is because that's another philosophical thing where in the wars that I've written, um, classes of ships means you have dozens or hundreds of ships like this, whereas um, all the space wars I've written have had like limited numbers of starships because they're incredibly expensive to make. And like at one time, I think in the war with the Tani, I think at any one time there was only like 8 or 9 cruisers in the entire fleet.
Mm,
So I think that's more of a thing like David Weber, with all of his ships, or Mal Cooper
right,
with the millions of ships that
right.
the Aeon 14 universe.
Sometimes I just think it's fun to throw some names out there just because it's that rule of cool that we talk about before.
Yeah.
Because especially for the military reader, I mean, I think maybe in general readers might appreciate it, but I think some of the military veterans that read that kind of thing they'll appreciate the different names, and even if
My
they
favorite
have.
thing to name is battle suits, honestly.
I don't know that I've ever named a battle. What do you name your battle suits?
um, let's see. I've got obviously the vigilantes are the ones from Drop Trooper, which is my favorite name. It was
The
a
vigilantes?
Yeah,
Is
vigilante.
that is that the type of armor suit
That's
that
the
they
type of
wear?
armor. A vigilante. There's vigilante, and then there's vigilante A1.
Nice.
um,
Nice.
and then there was in the Taken to the Star series, they've come up with this exoskeleton that it's the one we've been developing, DARPA's been developing for decades, but doesn't have a power source for, and that's called the Onyx. And then there is I'm trying to remember what I called the powered suits in the Earth at War series. It was some Norse term that was the the shield that the gods put between Earth and the sun. I can't think of it off the top of my head, but it's some odd Norse name. Um,
I can't remember
but
if I named my armor now.
you gotta name your armor, man. Seriously.
I no, I don't think I did. It's just called battle armor. The um unit that wears the battle armor that I came up with is they're like a futuristic kind of Navy SEAL almost, and I call them Sentinels.
Yeah.
And then the Sentinels are in the Armored Assault Corps or corpse, depending on the narrator. Uh, and that I think that was interesting. I wanted to come up with something that was like cool and like badass sounding, but not like they're space seals or they're space marines. Like I didn't want to use. I hate using the word space in
Oh yeah.
as uh, a naming convention.
The only time I used that was I kind of ironically in Earth at War, that was the Space Force was in charge of our starships,
Mhm.
and the main character kept telling me you had to name the ground force the Space Marines because he was a Marine.
Yeah, I mean, I get it. Like even when you talk about like the categories in Amazon where it's like Space Marine or Space Fleet, um, but I feel like if you're that far in the future, like we don't
Everything's space.
everything is in space, so you don't
Um,
need to put
the,
that
the,
prerequisite on there.
the suit of armor from Earth at War was Svalin, Svallin.
Uh,
It's like I said, it's a weird Norse word.
and do the different armor suits have different capabilities, or they just they're in different
Well,
universes, so you name them different things, or
no, they're in different universes. But in the Dropship universe, they had the regular vigilantes, and then they had something I think they call them boomers, and the boomers were artillery suits that had like big coil guns mounted on them that you could fire
oh yeah,
from a height, or big missile launchers. But that was something that was like part of the headquarters platoon.
kind of like
Yeah.
in Iron Man 2, where all of the different armor suits that the dude made that were drones were all they were all different types. Like you had the military artillery ones that like anchored themselves onto the floor and shot those big cannons, and then you had the Air Force fighter ones. I thought that was interesting.
Yeah. Or like in Iron Man 3 when he did the house party and all those different suits came up.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, I mean I like that again, I like having multiple things for specific uh uses. I should probably come up with a name for my Sentinel battle
The
armor
most fun I
instead of
had
just
was
having
the most
battle
fun I
armor.
had was naming mechs though in wholesale slaughter.
Mm,
Coming up with names for mechs was so much fun. I don't usually like coming up with names, but that was fun because I just love BattleTech. So
right. I'm trying to remember if I know that I named my mechs in Tranquility. Of course, I named in Tranquility the mechs were called rigs, not mechs. And in the first book they weren't combat rigs. They were like construction rigs that they had to retrofit to have military stuff on them. But I know in definitely in the third book, uh, they had um, names for the different mechs that they were using, and they were different sizes. But man, I can't remember. Can't remember what I called them. Dang it! I know I
well,
modeled them off of uh, Titanfall
yeah.
mechs. Trying to find the document that I.
I really enjoy coming up with mech names and the ways they look, the different designs and weapons. That's like the computer game and RPG geek in me.
Right.
Like I had the Golem and the Vindicator and a whole bunch of different Scorpion.
Yeah, so I had an Orca, a Mark II Orca. I had the Nasir horn, and the Nasir horn
Laser
was like,
Horn?
yeah, I don't know where I got that from, but they nicknamed it the Rhino. It was like a big, like armored
Like
assault.
to fight Spider-Man?
Yeah. And then oh, here, this is a good example of the shuttle deal. So I had a combat shuttle or a combat dropship called a Paladin, and then the civilian version of that was called a Starlifter. And then I had Raptor class fighters. Uh, yeah. Anyway, look, I'm glad that we carried the show by ourselves. Who needs James or Jeff to have a great podcast? Hope they do feel better. Both of them are kind of feeling under the weather this week. In all fairness, which is why they couldn't be here. But uh, hopefully next week we'll have the whole tribe back together. And I don't know what we're
One
talking
thing I was
about,
gonna
but it's
one
go
thing I
ahead,
was
Ray.
gonna bring up was that we haven't talked about is much is the name for guns. Do you give like you said you use like the M4, that kind of nomenclature like the Army? You do that a lot in your series?
I do. And I kind of go back and forth depending on what type of gun it is. Like for instance, if it's a military gun, then I'll give it a like a designation, right? Like I use the all the weapon systems are based around pulses or like energy beams in this universe, but they're not like laser like constant laser beams. They're pulses, and so the the convention that I came up with was depending on how long the bolt is, that goes in the naming convention. So if it fires a 2-inch bolt, it has a 2-inch and like kind of like a 9 millimeter almost, or that's the but in the military versions of those weapons, I have the designation for them. Like it's a if it was a medium pulse rifle, it would be PM2. So that it'd be a medium pulse rifle 2-inch. But if it was a civilian version of a gun, like a pulsar pistol or whatever, a lot of times I'll give those proper names, and then put like it's a like an arc like 2-inch. An arc like is the proper name, and then it fires a 2-inch bolt, kind of like a Colt 1911. What is that's it's a
Yeah.
proper name, um, or like a Glock. But in the military, I don't like you have the M4, right? But we never called it like give me the Colt AR, right? It was just the M4. The proper
Yeah.
name really didn't go a long way in the military context of the talking about the weapon systems, and like the M60. I don't know what the proper name for an M60 is, right? I don't even know that I know the manufacturer of the M60. I just know that it's
I
an
don't either.
M60. Um,
I
so
mean,
and a
I know
lot of
that
times
I know the new M240 is made by FN. I don't know who
right,
made the M60. Um, but like what I would do sometimes, I would mention once the name of the gun, and after
mhm,
that, it would just be a pistol. You know, like
right,
there was this really cool gun I came up with for um, the Recon series. It was a handgun used by these Force Recon Marines, and it had a long German name that basically meant uh, space production facility or something like that
yeah,
in German. It was like
right.
starts with a Z. I don't even remember it. It's that in like 79 or some number. But after that, it was just a pistol, and it fired a projectile that was kicked out of the barrel by an inert coal gas, and then after that, a rocket would would ignite, and it was like a spin stabilized mini rocket that
Mhm,
also had little steering vanes on it. And if you hook the pistol sights up to your helmet or maybe a pair of glasses with that in it, you could guide the rocket to the target as long as you
Oh,
could
nice.
keep looking at it.
Right.
Otherwise, if you couldn't guide it, then it was just, there's a sight, you fire it, and it goes basically where you shot it to.
Yeah.
But you could guide it and you could also, if you had the stuff in your helmet, you could change the nature of the warhead in flight. Like you could
Oh,
choose for the warhead to be armor piercing or explosive or anti-personnel, and it would switch something, like switch a switch in the warhead where explosive would or would not go off, or something like that.
do you so a lot of times I'll bounce, like I'll do what you do, where if I introduce a new weapon, then depending on, for instance, if it's my military character and he would know the name of it, then I'll write the name out. And if it's a character that wouldn't know the name, I'll just say rifle. Um, but even with the military characters, sometimes I'll go back and forth, um, either using the designation or saying rifle or weapon or something like that. And I try to change it up a little bit so I'm not repeating the same thing over and over and over again. Like he lifted the rifle, then he shot the rifle, and then he loaded the rifle. A lot of times I'll say he lifted the rifle up and fired the 2-inch, whatever. I try to change it up enough where it doesn't sound repetitive um, in the narrative of it. Do you do that as well, or do you just never mention the name again?
Well, I mean, it could be a rifle, it could be a Gauss rifle if it like fires electromagnetic slug, could be weapon. I don't really use the terminology too much for it.
Mm.
Just call it like a Gauss rifle.
Right on.
Like I said, I mentioned it the first time. Like this is the M79 KE rifle, and after that, it's just everybody calls it a Gauss rifle because
Yeah. With stuff like that, if there's letters and numbers, depending on what it is, in some situations I might have the characters refer to it, like for instance with the one you're talking about. If he's asking for the weapon from somebody, I would say, "Hey, throw me the 79," and it's like that's their slang term for the weapon. But the reader would still kind of get through context that that's what he's talking about. But I try to come up with names that you can do that with, or that you can come up with, slang terms for them, so it's not a repetitive list of numbers and letters. Oddly enough, speaking of not trying to hem up narrators, sometimes narrators don't understand that the letters that you're putting as an acronym for something can be said as a word or should be said as the letters, and sometimes they'll screw that up. I can't remember what book I was listening to
one
the other
guy,
day,
I
but
put MK, IV Roman numeral,
yeah,
and
so Mark IV.
Mark IV, but he kept calling it the MK4. And I'm like, no, it's just
Well, at
Mark.
least he didn't say the MKIV, because
Yeah.
that would screw me up.
That would be bad.
Well, we should probably wrap this up.
Yeah.
Thanks everybody for listening. Let us know in the group, in the Facebook group, or in the Discord, what your favorite naming conventions are, or what you like naming, or what you don't like named. If you see something in a book that you've read that you're like, nah, I don't like this, let us know what it is, so we don't do that.
Yeah.
But thank you everybody for hanging out and listening today. I'm Josh Hayes here for Rick Partlow. We have been the Military Science Fiction Podcast, and we will catch you on the next episode.
Reaction in the system on fire. Military science fiction podcast. Stories every Wednesday. Military science fiction podcast.